Good morning. This is Dr. Hansa Das, and I welcome you to my lecture series on Russian history. The topic which we are going to discuss today is War Communism in Russia 1918 to 1921. Russia was the first country in the world to set up a communist government after the revolution in 1917. After the end of the Tsarist rule, Lenin and members of the Bolshevik Party were determined to follow the principles of communism in true earnest. Therefore, in the middle of 1918, that is 8 months after the revolution had triumphed, a period of extreme communization began, which came to be known as War Communism. It continued up till 1921, after which the feasibility of War Communism came into question and a new policy, which came to be known as the New Economic Policy, was introduced. In today's lecture, we are going to focus upon the main features and developments under War Communism. War Communism had several distinct characteristics, including its endeavor to establish a communist society in Russia. This blueprint for a communist society held out great hopes for all segments of the population which had been deprived during the Tsarist rule, be it women, school children, peasants, workers, non Russians, or students. War communism promised to liberate women from household routines, to bring the government apparatus close to the people, and to work for full equality of all nationalities. What did war communism do for students and school children? The school the school was to be transformed from an instrument of class domination of the bourgeoisie into an instrument for a communist regeneration of society, because education during the Tsarist rule was a bourgeois institution, and therefore it was decided by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party that under war communism they would make education available to all those sections of society who were unable to avail it during the Tsarist rule. So, free and compulsory general and technical education with instruction in native language was to be made available to both sexes up to the age of 17. At the same time, adult education and financial aid for university education were also to be introduced. uh, what was done for the peasants, or what was envisioned to be done for the peasants? Planning was to be introduced into the national economy to help peasants with all their agricultural needs, to improve their housing situation, and to better working conditions, and to abolish completely child labor. Also, health centers were to be established with free medical care and drugs. Under war communism, it was also volunteered to liberate the masses from religious superstition. However, the policies under war communism brought great economic chaos and uh, depression in the economy in general. Uh, it contributed to the nation's chaotic economic situation, because under war communism, the main features were that the banks were nationalized, foreign trade and transport were nationalized, and most of industry was placed under workers' control. Now, such measures were designed not to ease the depressed economy but to deprive the propertied classes of their influence, because the bourgeois had all rights under the czarist government, and this was something which the Bolshevik Party tried to change under war communism. So Lenin called these innovations a gigantic step forward, but they were responsible also for accelerating economic disorder. The chief factor behind this economic disorganization was the system of factory committees. Now, factory committees supervised management, determined minimum production levels, and had access to all business records. Some committees developed the idea that all factories should be run for the benefit of local workers. And because no one dared to defy this concept, many factories weakened by war and revolution closed down. Those that continued to operate declined in discipline, and due to critical shortages of food and fuel, declined in production as well. The most important feature of war communism was the imposition of government control. All industries, everything private was nationalized, and government control was imposed over all sectors of the economy. This control sought to ensure priority for military supplies and to prevent sabotage, and it went into effect on 28th June 1918 when the government nationalized large industries. In taking over production and distribution, the government outlawed strikes and introduced compulsory universal labor duty for all able bodied citizens over 16 and under 50. Those who evaded the edict were severely punished. Governmental supervision of production and distribution also led to an abnormal rise in the number of bureaucrats. By mid 1920s, one out of every four adults in Petrograd and Moscow was a government functionary. This certainly caused unprecedented confusion and chaos all over the country as the bureaucracy expanded. Real chaos and bewilderment occurred when the government invoked a new policy on money and private commerce. It eliminated money as a medium of transactions between state institutions and as a medium of exchange among consumers and between consumers and Soviet organizations. All private trade was abolished and the property of all retail stores was confiscated. This created great resentment, and there was a bitter struggle between the peasantry and the new regime. As Marxists, the Bolsheviks considered agriculture an integral part of a socialized economy, and they held that the state must control agricultural production and make peasants agricultural workers. So, under war communism, the peasants virtually became agricultural workers. Uh, Under war communism, uh, the state sought to forcibly seize the surplus of the peasants, and this came to be known as prodrazvostka. So the slide into war communism was stimulated by food shortages and the failure of efforts to procure food, especially grain, from the peasants at official prices, and this compulsory uh, deliveries of food, these were systematized and given the name of prodrazvostka. It came to mean a policy in which each peasant household was ordered to deliver its surplus to the state. So, what actually happened was that all the surplus production or extra production of the peasants was forcibly seized by the state. uh, and the argument they put forward was that since the state was responsible for distributing the means of production among the resources among the people, so it should have all the means of production under its control. So this is a picture of grain procurement, how the state procured grain from the peasants forcibly. This is another picture of grain procurement, prodrazvostka. The state demanded all that the peasants had over and above an ill defined minimum requirement for himself and his family. So, what was left for the peasants was a bare minimum to feed their families, because everything surplus was taken over by the state. The process of grain confiscation went hand in hand with the effort to fan class warfare in the villages, and bitter struggle began between the government and the peasants and among the peasants themselves, because the peasants resented Prodrazvostka deeply, because of which numerous riots also took place in the country. Peasants could see little sense in producing farm surpluses which would be taken from them by requisition squads. That was what the picture on grain procurement was showing. Sowings were reduced, production fell, supplies came through black market. Supplies even of bread came through black market. There was a spectacular decline in population of big cities, and simultaneously two markets came to exist, one legal and the other illegal. And in 1918 to 1960% of consumption of bread grains in cities passed through illegal channels. Certainly, there was a lot of resentment among the peasants, and they resisted these policies. They resented and they resisted against Prodrazverstka. And there were several tactics in which the peasants reacted to the governmental control which was imposed through Prodrazverstka. At first, they tried to evade the May Decree. Now, the May Decree compelled peasants to surrender their grain surplus and appealed to the poor to begin a fight against kulaks or prosperous peasants. Second, they resorted to armed defense and seized, tortured, and killed many officials responsible for food collection. However, the government responded with punitive expeditions, which contributed to uh, the strained relationship between the peasants and the government. This is a picture of how the peasants resisted against uh, the government and against the policies of war communism. However, the most potent weapon of the peasants was that they sowed only enough land to feed their families and left the remainder of the land uncultivated. Because the entire surplus production of the peasants was forcibly seized by the state. Therefore, the peasants decided that they will produce only that much amount of grain that is needed to feed their families. And if there would be no surplus production, then definitely there would be no forcible seizures by the state as well. This form of resistance reduced the sowed area in Siberia by half. In the Ukraine, three quarters of the farmland went untilled. This paved the way for the Great Famine of 1921-22. And this is the picture of the Great Famine of 1921-22, which was the result of the policies under war communism and the imposition of governmental control at everything and at all sectors of the economy in Russia. Uh, this picture shows the horrors of war communism. It was envisioned by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party that uh, through war communism they would be able to truly establish the principles of communism in Russia, but it somehow backfired, and there was resentment amongst the peasants, amongst the workers, amongst the students, and all sections of the society which the government targeted. Government's takeover of production and distribution antagonized not only peasants but also workers who were also overburdened with regulations and military discipline and were displeased with their low wages. Lenin sensed the growing dissatisfaction with his policy throughout the country. As I said earlier, all these policies backfired, and finally, Lenin came to realize that war communism had placed Russia two steps back in the world economy, and that it was time to bring about certain elements of capitalism into the economy. And therefore, realizing that his survival was at stake, he abandoned war communism in March 1921 in favor of a limited capitalist experiment which came to be known as the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Because by putting a ban on everything private, by nationalizing everything, Lenin finally realized that certain elements of capitalism needed to be introduced into the economy if the economy was to function well, and if the resentment of the peasants and all sections of the society was to be curtailed. So, my next video on Russian history would focus upon the new economic policy and how the new economic policy altered the provisions of war communism and tried to bring about some stability in the Russian economy. Thank you for watching my video, and please uh, uh, keep a track of my next video, which is going to be on the new economic policy. Thank you.